right, we ready to get started? Well, good morning, everyone. My voice is slowly starting to come back, hopefully. Kind of starting to get that midnight DJ voice. My wife loves it. How'd everybody sleep? Good. We have a few people. How many people joined us that were new that haven't been here? Some people got in yesterday. Just one? Well, welcome back. I'm Ben. We met this morning early. Well, we were talking yesterday about what does it look like to love God and others. And we were looking at the greatest commandment. And as we kind of recognized, when Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, yesterday we were talking about what does it mean to love God. And we recognized that God is not just this out there thing, but God is actually Trinity. He's Father, Son, and Spirit. And if we're made to be imaged people, God in his own relationship, he actually created us out of the love of his own relationship within himself. And therefore, a response of that is that we are called to love God because he created us to love. He created us as a lover, created us to love him back. And then we see in the passage as we continue, it says, this is the first and greatest commandment. The second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commands. And I want to start by telling you a little bit of a story. I mentioned to you that I run a commercial fishing boat up in Alaska. I've been doing that for a long time. And a few years ago, I was working with my crew, and we were out on the boat, and we were fishing. It was a very strange day. Kind of started out pretty slow. We weren't catching a lot of fish, and then all of a sudden the wind started picking up, and we started getting some waves. It started getting kind of intense. And the fascinating thing about fish is that wind moves fish, which is the strangest thing in the world. When I started fishing, I'm like, how does wind push fish? It doesn't make any sense. The wind is above the water, but the wind actually moves the waves. The waves create more oxygen, and so then the fish move faster because they get more oxygen that gives them more energy, and so they push. And so we started catching lots of fish, and I used big nets. And so we had our nets, and we were trying to get through the fish as fast as we could. The way the fishing works is we have a net set out, and then we pull up underneath the net, and we go back and forth with the net and try to get the fish out of the net as fast as we can. As soon as our boat is full, we run and deliver those fish and come back to our net and keep going. And I was on one side of the boat, and my two crewmen were on the other side of the boat, and we were working the net. And I was sitting there, and we're just laughing and listening to music, and we're catching lots of fish. So we're excited. It's a little stormy, so you get a little nervous sometimes, especially as a captain of a boat, because you want to get the fish in the boat, but you don't want to get too many fish, or it gets a little dangerous and gets scary. And so we're trying to work through the net fast. And I look across the boat, and both of my crewmen are standing on the other side of the boat to me, and we're just working and talking, and all of a sudden their eyes just get really big. And I'm like, what are you guys doing? And one of them just goes, oh, crap. And I'm like, he didn't say crap. He said something else. And I'm like, what? And he goes, look. And I turned around, and I looked and saw this boat, and it's gone up on its end, on its stern, and then it just sunk. And there was a guy, and he just dove off of the boat into the water. And obviously, that's a crisis situation. In the moment, you're trying to figure out what to do. I've got a ton of fish on the boat. We're kind of in a sketchy situation. We're trying to get pick through the fish so that we're not in trouble. But obviously, someone's life is more important. And so got on the radio, called Mayday. Boats were on the way, and we got off of our net and went to rescue this guy. So we pulled up to this guy trying to swim. He didn't have a life jacket on. Gear is everywhere. He had nets and fish, and there were gas barrels. And so we pulled him into the boat, we grabbed over and pulled him in the boat. It's not that easy sometimes to pull somebody in a boat when they've got rain gear on and all those waders. It's hard. That's why a lot of people drowned. They get out of a boat and then they can't pull themselves back in the boat because they're too heavy. So we got him in the boat. This gentleman's name was Chris. He was obviously a little traumatized. shaking, and he's cold and nervous. He starts, cutting his rain gear off. And I'm like, hey, man, it's going to be all right. We got you. And I start panicking. I'm like, hey, before we do anything, where is everybody? He's like, well, what are you talking about? I'm like, where's your crew? Where is everybody? And he's like, well, what do you mean? And I'm like, where is your crew? Because I'm like, are they trapped into the boat? The boat's sunk. And he's like, no, we're good. I'm by myself. And I'm sitting here going, what do you mean you're by yourself? Like, you had a full boat of fish. And he's trying to pull a pack of cigarettes out of his pocket, and they're all soaking wet, and he's trying to light them. I'm like, bro, that's not going to light, man. And I'm like, why are you by yourself? And he's like, well, we had gone into town to get more fuel, and there was, it was calm, and there weren't a lot of fish, and so we thought we could leave our nets out and get back. And then when we came back to our nets, it was stormy, and our nets were plugged with fish, and so we just round haul all of our nets onto the boat. And then we had too much weight on the boat, so I put my crew on another boat, and we were heading back in, and we got close enough, and they took off and left me. And then a wave came over and took the boat, and that's why I sunk. And it's a scary moment. I mean, if we weren't there, he didn't have a life jacket on. Could have been really bad for him. Thankfully, we were able to get him to shore, and they were okay. We went and got all his gear. But on that day, he actually left. This is what we call a liner glove. We wear these inside of our rubber gloves. It keeps our hands warm. And he left this on my boat, and I've always kept it. Because I remember, I was thinking afterwards, I'm like, man, this is such a good illustration. It reminded me that the reality is, like, we were not made to travel alone. That sometimes we think, oh, life is going great. I'm feeling fine. There's no storms. Things are great. I don't really need anybody. I can do this on my own. And it's always that way until what? Things get hard. Things get difficult. And the reality is, like, as we talked about, like, we were not created to journey alone. God created us to be in relationship. He created us to be with people and in community, and especially with him. And this guy, Chris, thought he could just do it all by himself, and it would have been a bad ending for him. And so I've always kept this because I want to remember that any time that I think, oh, I've got it on my own, I can do this, I don't. I need other people. I need Jesus. I need God in my life, and I need community. It's so important. I need neighbors in my life. And so as we look at this passage, I want us to look at what does it mean to be a neighbor, and who is our neighbor? What do you think? Who is our neighbor? What do you think, Tanner? Everybody. Everybody's our neighbor? Yeah. I think that's true. It's easier said than done. I asked my son this morning. He got up early, and we told our kids no screen time in the morning, so he sat down on the couch with me, and it was about 6 o'clock, and he was really bored. And I'm like, buddy, what are you going to do? And he's like, I don't have anything to do, Papa. I'm like, you got to learn to do other things other than screens, bro. I'm like, go down and kick a soccer ball around. He's like, it's dark. I'm like, you're right. I'm like, well, you can help me kind of prepare and think about my message. And he was like, really? So I asked him, I said, well, buddy, I'm talking about what does it mean to be your neighbor today. I said, who is your neighbor? Which is funny because I asked my kids this last year, and they're learning something. And he said, well, it's you, Papa. And I said, I'm your neighbor? And he said, yeah, because you're the closest person to me. And I actually liked that. I was like, that's a good answer, bud. Like, I'm right next to you, and so in that moment, I am your neighbor. And your sister's your neighbor too, don't forget that. We have to talk about that a lot with our kids. But understanding who our neighbor is, it's easier said than done sometimes. Because it's one thing to say, oh yeah, it's everyone. But as we'll see in this story today, sometimes it's easy to say that when it's people that we want to spend time with. It's easy to say that when it's somebody that we have to interact with all the time. But sometimes it's people that we can kind of choose not to interact with. Or they're people that maybe God wants them to be my neighbor, but they're not really in my vicinity. They're not right next to me, so maybe they're not my neighbor. So I want to look at this passage today. Luke 10, 29 through 37. Can we read this? Or this is a long one. Would one person be willing to read this for us? Can you read it from there? Would one person be able to read this for us? Yeah, go for it. All right, so this is the passage in Luke where we see the greatest commandment, and it follows. It says, obviously we see that this man asks Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? And so what I want you to do is I want you at your tables, I think we can do this, at your tables, I want you to just take about 3 to 4 minutes as a table, and I want you to talk together, and I want you to try to take note, what are all of the actions, what are all of the things that are happening in this passage? So just make a list. What are the different actions that you see this Samaritan man doing to this Jewish man who's been attacked and is wounded? What are all the things that are happening? There's a lot of things happening in this passage. So just kind of discuss it at your table, and then we're going to kind of try to track some of these things down. So take 3 to 4 minutes and do that right now. And I'm going to get this whiteboard. We'll write them on here. I think it'll be all right. We'll figure it out. All right, we feel like you have a pretty good list. All right, start throwing out some observations. What are some things that you observed? Yes. So he put aside the prejudice. Yes. Brad, what do you tell us a little bit more about that? Yes. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that is, it's hard. I know it's hard to hear because of the rain, but what Brad was saying was that there was a prejudice against the Samaritans. And really what he's talking about there is that the Samaritan people Why, why were the Samaritans hated by the Jews? Why did they not like the Samaritans? Does anybody, Brad kind of mentioned it. Does anybody give me some more details about that? They were actually despised more than the Gentiles. So in Israelite history, Israel was actually divided into two kingdoms. So there was initially it was the northern kingdom, which is Israel, and there was the southern kingdom, which is Judah. And when the Assyrian Empire came and took over the northern kingdom and sent people into captivity, some of them who were old, wounded, weak, they stayed behind. And then eventually they actually came and took over the southern kingdom quite a few years later. And actually all those people got captured, got sent to Babylon. And then they sent people from the Babylonian Empire and other empires to go in and kind of take over the country. Kind of like, we want you to go in, start taking over the country. And so those that were left, those Israelites, the Jewish people that were left, they actually ended up staying. But those people, the Babylonians and those Gentiles, the people from outside, they brought a lot of their gods with them. They brought a lot of their different idols that they worshipped. And so, the Israelites were in captivity for a long time in Babylon. And so a lot of those people ended up intermarrying. They ended up starting to follow, even though they still sort of followed their own God, the God that we believe in, but they also started saying, hey, yeah, well, if I'm going to marry you, I guess I will start worshiping your idols also. And so then eventually, as we see in Nehemiah, when we see the Israelites get permission to come back and rebuild the temple, well, those that were left, they were the Samaritans, and they were despised because they made it really difficult. They didn't want the Jewish people to come back and reestablish the temple. And so they fought, and they fought them. They said, hey, we don't want you to reestablish here. And so the Samaritans were kind of looked at like half-breeds. They were looked at almost worse than Gentiles, because they weren't just people that didn't believe. They were people that claimed they believed, but they also believed in other gods, and they intermarried. And so they were really despised. There was a lot of prejudice against Samaritans. In fact, Samaria was kind of in the middle of the country, and as you see, if you look at the map of Israel, you have northern Galilee, and then you have Samaria, and then down below, down in the southern region, that's where Jerusalem is at. And so they had to cross through Samaria. If you were coming from Galilee, you had to cross through Samaria to get down to Jerusalem. In fact, a lot of the Jewish people would travel around Samaria in order to get down there, because they didn't want to potentially run into somebody, potentially become unclean as they were heading to the temple. And so they would take extra days to go around. That's why it's so fascinating, the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman. He goes right through Samaria, and he actually sits down with the Samaritan woman and talks with her, which was, you would absolutely not do that if you were a teacher or a priest. You would never sit with a woman, let alone a Samaritan. And so it's a fascinating story where he went right through Samaria, ended up engaging with that woman. We won't go into that story today, but it is fascinating. So there was definitely prejudice against Samaritans. And this Samaritan man, he helped a Jewish man. So that was one of the observations. Okay, what's another one? Yes. So he spent some of his own resources and money on this man. Good. Okay, what else? What else did you see? Yes. Oops, I spelled that wrong. Great. Anything else? I'm going to come over here so I can hear you. Yes. Yep. Yes. So good. So it wasn't like this isn't like some sort of guy at the front of Safeway ringing a bell and you're throwing your change in the bucket. No, this is a significant amount of money that he gave. So those resources and that money, it wasn't just something small. It was a big sacrifice. That's right. That's right. He promises he'll come back and give more if they need it. That's right. Excellent. Any final thoughts, or we'll keep going?
I think it's also cool how you said that, like, came to the place and saw him, like, saying kind of like he purposely chose to, like, make eye contact and see him, because I feel like so many of us, when we're, like, even walking down the street and passing, like, I don't know, someone homeless or something, we try and not make eye contact, because that's just our like, first go-to, but
Yes. He saw him. I love that. So he used his eyes. He didn't try to avoid not seeing him. He saw him, and he was willing, he was open to seeing somebody that was hurting outside of his own frame of reference. I love it. All right, well, let's dig into this a little bit. Would somebody willing to pass these out for me? And you could take notes on these if you want. Maybe I'll just kind of pass half down this way and half the other way. I think we should have enough. Well, let's look at this a little bit more closely. So in Luke, there's actually 12 Greek verbs. Can you hear me in the back? I know it's like, this is not the best day for me with not having a good voice, and it's raining cats and dogs. There's 12 Greek verbs that are used here for 8 actions. And so we're going to look into each one of these and find out exactly what it's talking about. All right, the first one, which... Is it pronounced Mika? Yes, Mika. First thing she said, he saw him. So that's the first verb that we see. And that's exactly right. He didn't pretend that he didn't see the man suffering. He didn't shut his eyes. He let it sink in, and he really saw him. And I think that's exactly right. Sometimes when we say, who's our neighbor? Well, we go, oh, it's everyone around us. But the reality is, like, we pass people all the time that are hurting, that are suffering, and sometimes we choose not to see them. I live in a city called Portland, Oregon. The homeless crisis in Portland is absolutely astounding. I can't, it's hard to describe to you the amount of homelessness that we have in Portland. You'll go down streets and there'll be miles and miles of tents. And so often it's hard. I'm trying to, teach my kids how to be a good neighbor, but sometimes I don't want to see the people. I don't want to see people hurting because I just want to get on with my day. Because sometimes it's really hard to see people hurting, because if I actually acknowledge that I see them, then the Spirit sometimes in me is saying, hey, you should go talk to that person. And I'm going, well, that might distract me from my day. I have a lot of things I need to do. Or what if they're going to ask me for something? Or they're probably drunk, or they won't know what I'm saying. So I love that this Samaritan man, that the first thing that we see is he saw the man. And he didn't try to avoid him, didn't try to go, oh, I can tell there's somebody there, I'm just not going to look. But he saw the man with his eyes, and he was moved by that. Second thing that we see, he had compassion. The Greek word used here for compassion is skladkonid. I'm so bad at saying this. Skladkonidzmo. Every time I struggle with it. Spladkonidzomai. Is that how did I pronounce it right, Rick? It's perfect. Spladkonidzomai. It literally means to have your bowels churning. In this sense, compassion is costly response to the suffering of others. It's empathetically and emotionally expensive. You actively and cognitively choose to suffer alongside the hurting. And this isn't just like I feel sorry for this person. But it's one of those moments when you kind of, your body it's like your bowels are churning. Something inside of you, it makes you almost feel sick. You can't stop thinking about it. Have any of you ever felt that way when you've seen somebody that's hurting? Yeah, tell me about it.
One time I was like, one of those, like, it was like, well, how when you see a old person, you usually like
Right. Yeah, when we meet people that are hurting, and sometimes when you sit down and talk with someone, it's easy sometimes to keep them distant, and then you have a conversation with them, and all of a sudden you hear their story, and you start to feel, oh wow, like I can sense what this person is going through. I ran into a man on the bridge, the swinging bridge down in what's the name of the town down there with the swinging bridge? Hanapepe. And I ran into this old man down there the other day with my kids. He had the cutest little puppy I've ever seen in my life. And he was fishing. He had a net, and he was catching, which was amazing to me as a fisherman. I was fascinated by it. He was throwing his net off of the bridge and catching fish below, and then he'd pull them all the way up. And so I sat and talked with him for a little bit. And just hearing him talk about how he makes money and how hard it must be as a local to try to make money and make a living. And I felt compassion for this man. I almost wanted to, he actually was very proud. He caught a fish while we were there. My kids were excited. And I almost wanted to buy the fish from him because I felt compassion for where this man was at. As I told you, I used to run a recovery community. And I sat with people day in and day out as a pastor who did a lot of pastoral counseling. And I would have people come in my office. And kind of that was one of the things, honestly, that I loved about pastoring is that you know, when people come out, it's like we're going to give the best of ourselves to you for free. It's a gift from the church. It's a gift from Jesus to you. And so we want to sit with you no matter where you're coming from. And so I would have lots of interesting people come into my office. And then in our community, there was a lot of people. And I would also experience something called compassion fatigue. Do you know what compassion fatigue is? What is that? I see some heads. Yeah. Yes. Yes, that's right. So sometimes we can experience compassion fatigue where you're interacting with people so much that you come home at night and you can't stop thinking about the stories that you heard from the day, those kind of things. And I experienced that a lot in my ministry. And I feel like that was one of the things that I often was asking Jesus to give me strength to kind of push through, because sometimes it was really hard not to bring work home with me. My heart was always hurting for these people that I was working with. So he had compassion on the man, and it moved him. He couldn't help. He was compelled. He had to go and talk to the man, or go help this man. The third one is that he went to him. This is in direct contrast with the two religious leaders who, upon seeing the man, walked away from him on the far side of the road. So, and both of those people were people that should have helped the man. I mean, in a sense, you have a Levite. I mean, these were people that really should have, they're teachers of the law. They're people that know Scripture. They know what they should be doing, and yet they avoided him. They stayed on one side, and they just kept going, stuck with their agenda, didn't go. But this Samaritan man felt compassion, and he crossed the road. He went to the man. And I think that action of stepping into helping someone is really, it's setting aside all of your agenda, setting aside the things that you have going on. I'm sure he was going somewhere. I think we said that. He put aside, approached him and had compassion. He spent some of his money and resources. He probably had an agenda. He had things that he needed to do. And he's like, you know what? This may be more important. This man is hurting right now. And I'm going to go over to him and I'm going to help him. Next one. He bandaged up his wounds. This would have required direct contact with this wounded man, potentially getting him dirty, bloody, and becoming ritually unclean had the man died in the process. So, you know, sometimes when we think about these stories and we hear these growing up as kids, you know, you hear, oh yeah, man, you know, Samaritan man came and helped this wounded man, kind of fell off of his horse. But the man was half dead. Somebody who's half dead isn't just like he's got a little bump on his head. He potentially was unconscious, probably bloody. Who knows how long he'd been there? He'd been beaten half to death. And so he was probably very dirty. And so he went and bandaged up the man. That means he had to touch him, potentially becoming unclean. What happened if he died while he was cleaning him? I mean, there's all sorts of things that could have happened, let alone it's a Samaritan and a Jewish man. What if another Jewish person came by and saw this Samaritan man messing with the Jewish man? They might have thought he was the one that beat him up. Like, why are you touching that Jewish man? Get away from him. And yet he was willing to risk that. So he bandaged up his wounds. The idea of being ready to go and do something like that and stepping in to help somebody, it's not easy to do. It's one thing to quickly answer, well, everybody's our neighbor. But the reality is when it comes down to it, how willing are we to step in and help our neighbors, the people that are hurting around us? All right. Next one. He anointed him with oil. It's an ancient Jewish medical treatment for wounds. It was costly, the oil was expensive, but he also had it on him. And I think as we think about the way that we start applying some of these principles in our own lives, are we prepared to walk with people and to help people that are hurting? And part of the reason that I want to spend time this week talking through some of the things we're talking through is part of the preparation, I think, of helping people in this world that are hurting is to actually think through, what would I do if I came along somebody that is hurting? How would I ask them questions that could draw them into a conversation around what is their purpose in life? Where are their pains? Where are their hurts? How can I help them? And I think it's really important to be prepared ahead of time. And he had this oil with him. And I think sometimes we can pass by something like that. But for me, I've really worked in my life to go, how do I have a conversation with somebody? As a pastor, I would have many people come in my office, and sometimes they had shocking stories, things that I didn't know how to be prepared to have conversations around. It reminds me of a story of I had a transgender woman transgender person who used to come meet with me in my office. And it was very interesting. Her name is Christy. And she came to our church. She was very interested in Jesus, but had a really tragic, abusive past. And she used to come and she would meet with me regularly. She'd come to my office, and she would confess to me that she had spent her tithe money on a poker machine. And she wanted to talk to me about it and confess to me. Sometimes I think she thought I was a priest. But initially when she came in, I had never really interacted with someone like that. And so it was hard. I was trying to learn how to not feel shocked, not make her feel uncomfortable, but at the same time wanted to show her love and compassion, the love of Jesus, as I know he's called me to do, to love my neighbor, to love people in my life, and to really show her love. At the same time, recognizing I feel really uncomfortable in this situation. And I think sometimes if we can prepare ourselves to go, how would I interact with somebody that's very different from me, culturally very different from me in what I believe? How can I show them the love of Christ? How can I be prepared to walk with them and help them, even if it's something that may be very difficult for me and challenging? And so as we talk this week and think through how do we walk with hurting people, I want to use this as a way to say, how can you be prepared to walk with the people in your life that you interact with, that you may come across, that maybe are very different, maybe as different as the Samaritans to the Jews? How can I come alongside? How would I be able to walk with them? How would I be able to help them and be prepared to do that? All right, the next one. He loaded him on his donkey. This would have required great physical exertion. The wounded man must have been hard to lift on a horse in his condition. Furthermore, this required the Samaritan to walk while the wounded man rode the donkey. This action also involved risk. What if the Samaritan had dropped him? What if in this vulnerable position the robbers had returned while the Samaritan was on foot? So, of course, some of this stuff is conjecture. We don't know exactly what it was like, but the reality is this person probably was unconscious, couldn't get on his donkey himself. He took the man and put him on his donkey. Have you ever tried to lift somebody and put them on a table? People are heavy. I mean, my kids are getting heavier every day, let alone trying to lift a person and put them up onto a horse or up onto a donkey. It must have taken a lot of physical exertion for him, and yet he was willing to do that. Sometimes it's costly. It's costly to help people. And sometimes we allow those kind of risks, those risks of the inconvenience, the risks of how much it's going to cost us to keep us from doing the things that we know that God is calling us to do. I mentioned to you that I used to run a skateboard ministry. There's a little bit of a different kind of situation, but in the church that I worked in, one of the biggest issues with our skateboard ministry was that a lot of the older ladies in the church were getting upset because the dishes in the kitchen were getting dusty. Because we had skateboard ramps in the basement of the church, and kids would skate, and the dust would get out and float through the air, and then it would get into the kitchen, and it would get all over the dishes. And, some of the kids were smoking cigarettes in the parking lot, and they leave the cigarette butts. And I remember we had a conversation around whether we should continue our skateboard ministry, because it was starting to make the church kind of messy. It was costing the church a lot to try to keep everything clean, and it felt like an inconvenience. And I think the reality is that happens a lot in the way that we kind of excuse ourselves from doing the ministry that God has called us to really truly love our neighbors. It can cost us sometimes. It can be very costly. It can be dirty. I mean, you could ask Rick if the church has had to spend a lot of money and there's been a lot of cost doing the kind of ministry that it takes to really love this community. It's very costly. And I think, but that is what Jesus has called us to, because if we truly are going to love our neighbor, if we're going to love people with the kind of love that God created in us as imaged people, we have to recognize it's going to cost us something. And this man, this Samaritan man, obviously, the physical exertion and what it cost him to put this man on the risk that he took, all those kind of things, I think we have to acknowledge that that's something that happens in this story. And I think we need to, in our own lives, be prepared for that. That as we follow Jesus, that sometimes it's going to take risk and it's going to cost us something. All right. He took the wounded man to the inn. The Samaritan's personal agenda, his schedule, and his resources must have been completely rerouted and reappropriated. So like I said before, who knows where this man was heading, but to stop what you're doing, stop where you're going. You know, it's not like they had cell phones back then and he could text whoever he was going to visit, hey, I'm going to be a day late. I found this wounded Jew on the side of the road. I'm going to, first of all, they'd be like, why are you even interacting with a Jew? They're going to, this guy's going to spit on you or whatever if he wakes up. But he rerouted his whole thing to go take this man to an inn. So he completely, his agenda, his schedules, resources were completely rerouted and reappropriated. And I think as we think about that, the reality is, like, when we help people, sometimes it's going to be an inconvenience. Sometimes it's actually going to take up time. Sometimes we have to apologize and say, hey, I know that I said I'd be here this time, but I just happened to run into this person and have this amazing conversation. And they were hurting. And I sat with them and I prayed with them. I wanted to give them my time because that's what Jesus would have done for me, and he's called that. His spirit was moving in me. I felt that compassion, and I felt like I needed to take the time to spend time with this person. So, the reality is, like, it takes time to help people that are hurting. And I know when I was first with Daisha, that was one of the hard parts in our marriage as we got married, and I was running this recovery ministry. And it was so frustrating for her sometimes that I would be, I'd be like, hey, babe, I'll be home in 20 minutes. And then 2.5 hours later, she's like, what happened? I'm like, oh, Jimmy needed a ride home. I had one of these guys that worked with my recovery ministry. He'd show up at church, and then he didn't have a ride. And he lived about a half an hour away, and he'd be like, hey, is there any way I can get a ride home, bro? And then he'd want me to take him for lunch, and I'd get him some food. And then I'd show up, and Daisha would be really upset. And so we had to work through that sometimes in our marriage and going, hey, babe, this is part of what I feel like I'm called to do. Now, it doesn't mean that every time that happens, I need to have good boundaries too. And we'll talk about that in a couple days. But the reality is, like, sometimes it's going to take time. It's going to take our agendas away, what we have planned. Number 8, he cared for him. The initial medical care involved bandaging and anointing his wounds. But they weren't enough to heal his wounds. More care was required, and more care was sacrificially given. So when he went to the inn, he wanted to make sure that this man was going to be taken care of, right? So there's this part of it that he really deeply, not only did he feel compassion, but he actively cared for the man. And I think that's really important. And then he took out and gave 2 silver coins to pay for 2 months at the inn, with a promise of more money that if it should be needed. These 2 silver coins would have paid for about 2 months' stay at the ancient inn, indicating the severe condition of this man. So obviously, we recognize, and as you guys pointed out, he spent a lot of money and resources on him. He approached him, you mentioned, days, it's worth a day's worth, 1 denarii is worth a day's labor. So he spent a lot of money on this man and said that he would come back. I doubt that this Samaritan man was a very rich man, but he was willing to sacrifice what he had to give it to this man. So beautiful. And so this story, I think, is so much more than sometimes when we read over it. There's so much more detail in what's going on in this story. And when we think about what it means to love our neighbor, this is the illustration that Jesus gives. And, I was thinking about this the other day as I was reading over this, and I don't know why I haven't thought this before. But it's one thing if this is just a story, you know, like Jesus, if Jesus was just going like, here's something that I saw the other day that is an illustration. But actually what I love about this story is this is a picture of the imagination of Jesus. Like Jesus is actually giving a parable, and this comes out of Jesus' imagination of this is what it means to love your neighbor. And he tells this story, which in my mind creates more power to the story. Because this is, we actually get in this moment to hear Jesus' thoughts as Jesus is expressing this is what it means to love your neighbor, and he lays it out so clearly. Therefore, I think it's really important for us to recognize this. Now, my question to you is, do you think that this is sort of one of those things that's give or take? You know, is it something that's like, well, yeah, if it works out, if I'm in the right spot, I can do this. Is this something we should try to do, or is this something that we really are called to do? Anybody? Called to do. Yeah, it's a command. Jesus says, go and do likewise. So it's not like, well, if it works out, go do it. If you happen to see somebody and it works out, no, he says, go and do likewise. So when it says love your neighbor, Jesus is actually calling us to this. Now, it doesn't mean we don't have boundaries in our life, but it does mean that we shouldn't avoid looking at the hurting people. We shouldn't avoid being scared because they're very different from us, or they may interact, they may not like what we have to say. I know for me, as somebody who's been an evangelist and done a lot of evangelism work, sometimes I'm nervous about how people are going to interact if I go, hey, have you ever heard of Jesus? What do you think of this? It's interesting. I've never thought about this, and I don't want to try to go too far into this, but I would love to think through the parallel. What would be a Samaritan? What would be the illustration of a Samaritan today? And I know that when I think of the difference between a Gentile, which is somebody that doesn't know Jesus, well, for me, somebody who's never heard of Jesus, easier to talk to them about Jesus. Harder people for me is people that claim they know Jesus, but then they've kind of mixed Christianity with other things, and I actually feel like they're working against Christianity. There's a lot of churches out there that teach things that I feel like are non-biblical, and yet they claim they're Christ-following churches, but then they add in a bunch of things. And that makes me angry, and then I feel sometimes the animosity that probably the Jews felt towards the Samaritans. And yet Jesus has called me to still love those people. And so I actually believe that we're moving into a time, and we would even say in Portland that we moved into a season of where it used to be almost post-Christian, where it was like people that have kind of rejected, there's a lot of people that have rejected the church. I actually believe we're moving into a season where we would say in Portland, we're actually in a time moving into pre-Christianity, where a lot of their parents rejected the church, and now a lot of their kids have never actually heard the gospel, and they've never even heard about Jesus. And I actually was sitting on it I sat next to a guy on the plane when I was flying here, and I just happened to kind of eavesdrop on what he was looking at on his computer, and he was reading the Bible. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I asked him, I said, oh, what are you reading? He says, oh, I'm reading the Bible. And I'm like, oh, really? And he said, yeah. And I'm like, oh, are you going to Bible college? Or, oh, no, I've never read it before. And I'm like, really? He goes, yeah, I'm starting in this Genesis book. And I'm like, yeah, the beginning, that's Genesis. And I'm like, that's really fascinating. I'm like, what made you interested in reading the Bible? He goes, well, I've never really heard much about it, but I started dating this girl, and she's a Christian, and I wanted to know more about what she's all about. Which I'm not advertising missionary dating, but I do think it's fascinating that Generation Z, this younger generation, is actually more open than ever to hearing about the church and hearing about Christ, because a lot of them have never actually heard about Christianity. Their parents rejected the church, and they never grew up knowing anything about Jesus, and so there's a lot more openness now to actually spirituality and people having conversations. And so I just want to encourage you that as Jesus commanded us and said, go and do likewise, I think that's what we do here. That we need to respond in the same way as we see people that are hurting. I want to show you just a quick video that a friend made me for my refuge community that I think really kind of illustrates this point of what it means to be people that are wounded healers. All right, 1 second here.
Once a great ship was built. It was strong, mighty, something to behold. And it was given a great purpose. control the situation. The ship was wiped out by the storm. It found itself wrecked on some rocks. It couldn't move. It couldn't go anywhere. The great ship was lost in the ocean. As it sat there for a long time, it sat with its failure. Its failure to fulfill its purpose. But something unforeseen happened. Slowly the water seeped into the seeds, and they began to germinate and grow. They grew and grew, and over time, there was a large forest. One day, another ship came passing by, also broken and floundering from an unforeseen storm. It came to the broken ship island and asked, "May I rest here a while? I'm so tired from my journey." The great ship replied, "Sure, by all means." As the new ship rested, the great ship gave some of its wood to build a shelter for the crew of the other ship. They stayed a while. After they rested and were healed, the new ship left renewed for its journey. "Thank you for your hospitality. You really helped me." After a while, another ship came by. That ship also asked if it could rest for a while. It had been bruised and battered in a storm too, and needed a place to be. The great ship took some more of its wood and built another shelter for the much larger crew. When it was healed, it also went on its way. This kept happening. New ship after new ship kept coming, all injured by an unforeseen storm and needing a place to be for a while. The great ship realized that it had something to give, a place to rest, and solidarity from being wrecked as well by the unforeseen storms of the great sea. Pretty soon, the great ship decided to build a lighthouse so that all ships passing by that way could find a place to be cared for, to rest, and then continue on their journeys. Throughout the years, the great ship cared for many, many broken and bruised ships. This was a quizzical mystery to the great ship. Out of its own wreckage and failure, it became a gift to others. It always wondered if this was the purpose all along.
And I love that. I think it's such a beautiful illustration of how God can take our woundedness and our pain, and he can make us into wounded healers. And many of you heard my story yesterday, and I feel like that's what God has done in my own life. Out of a lot of my pain and my brokenness, that he actually took a lot of that pain and brokenness and actually used it for good. Used it to walk with other people, a lot of hurting people. And I think for a lot of you, you're trying to figure out while you're here, what is your purpose for me? What do you want to do with my life? And one thing I know he wants us to do is to love our neighbors and figure out how to do that. And each of you will figure out how to do that in your own way, and contribute and participate in what Jesus is doing in this world. So, Rick, I'm sorry I'm a little over. So I will end now. But I will see you tomorrow morning. Tomorrow we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be walking through something called the 5 voices. So we're going to be really looking at what is some of your leadership, your personality style. So we're going to be talking through some of that, and it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to pass these out. This is one last thing that this is kind of homework for the week. We're going to have a discussion about this later in the week. So if you get a chance kind of in your devotional time to read through this, it's a little essay called Staying at the Table. So if you could read this, and then we'll kind of discuss this on Friday. All right. Thank you.